Greg Peterson here, and I want to thank you for listening to the Urban Farm Podcast. We wouldn't be able to keep doing these great shows without you. So as a token of my appreciation, I'd like to offer you access to a list of our top 10 episodes I personally find most inspiring. If you enjoy the Urban Farm Podcast but don't have time to listen to every one, then you will love this list. Although all our guests have great information to offer, if you are short on time, these 10 are must-listens. To get access to the top 10 most inspiring podcast episodes, text FARMER to 44222. That's FARMER to 44222. And enjoy listening.
You're listening to the Urban Farm Podcast, your partner in the Grow Your Own Food revolution. Whether you've just been introduced to urban farming or you're a lifelong advocate, we're sure you'll leave feeling more informed, equipped, and empowered to dig deeper into the soil of your local food economy. With you every step of the way, here's your host, Greg Peterson.
Today on the Urban Farm Podcast, we have Josh Volk of Slowhand Farm to talk about his experience with compact farms. Josh is the author of Compact Farms by Storey Press, which comes out in February of 2017. He is the proprietor of Slowhand Farm in Portland, Oregon, and has been working on and managing small farms around the country for the last 20 years, studying the systems that make them efficient. He travels the United States and abroad, consulting with farmers and researchers, teaching farm apprentices and new farmers, presenting workshops at agricultural conferences, and writing articles for publications, including Growing for Market magazine. Josh didn't come from a farming background. He grew up on the edges of cities, and his parents had vegetable gardens that he mostly ignored. When he went away to college and started cooking for himself, he became more interested in where his food came from and how to grow it. That interest grew, inspired by books on small-scale food production. There weren't many writers on the topic then, and that wasn't very long ago. Welcome to the show today, Josh.
Glad to be here. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at now?
Well, I think that's a pretty good start to the story there. You know, I grew up mostly in towns. My family kind of moved around a bit, so it was mostly Midwest and East Coast. And I was very into bicycles and racing bicycles and that kind of thing, and just always liked to know how things worked. And so I went to school to get a mechanical engineering degree, thinking that I was going to go into the bicycle industry. And while I was in school, I was cooking for myself in college, and I had cooked in my family. My mom had myself and my sisters make meals for the family when we were in high school, and so I had some cooking background there, and then started cooking for myself. And I loved to eat. So loving to eat was kind of the thing that made me want to cook. And then I always liked to know how things work. So that was kind of the connection with the bicycles and the mechanical engineering, was I wanted to know how the bikes worked, and I worked as a bike mechanic. And then it became the same thing with the food. It was like I was cooking the food. I wanted to know how to cook all these different dishes, and then I wanted to go that next step and figure out, well, where are all these ingredients coming from? Where are the vegetables coming from? Where are the grains coming from? All those types of things. And so that combined with volunteering. So as I was working as a mechanical engineer, I graduated, got my mechanical engineering degree, didn't end up going into the bicycle industry, but ended up working in a factory in Silicon Valley. And while I was there, I was volunteering in some community gardens in East Palo Alto. And East Palo Alto is a really very poor neighborhood. It was this one neighborhood that was kind of left behind by the tech boom. Wow. And I was right next door in Palo Alto. That's where I was living at the time. But there were these amazing community gardens that this organization was starting. And so I was volunteering there, and between that and having my own garden, and then also taking some classes, some workshops from John Jevons, who, he wrote the How to Grow More Vegetables, and I had read his book. And actually in Palo Alto, that's where his original project was with Ecology Action. And they, at that time, and it may still be there, they had a garden store that was still remaining. And that's where I did my shopping for my garden supplies. And so through that garden store, he taught some workshops in Palo Alto. And all those things really inspired me to think, instead of sitting in this concrete block building with no windows and designing little widgets that, I'm sure were contributing something, but I couldn't directly understand what it was. I'd much rather be out in the community helping people like I see the people in these community gardens to produce food, to eat good food. And, that would just be a much more exciting environment. So that's what I got really excited about, the potential for urban agriculture, because urban was my context. I mean, I was really from more urban background, more urban spaces than rural. And then the agriculture part, was just wanting to grow the food, but not just on a small gardening, kind of backyard gardening scale, kind of on a bigger, more productive scale and really involving people. And I kind of, naively, I think, thought, oh, well, I'm smart. I could make this work economically and, we would save all this money. And some of that was coming out of reading John Jevons' book and some of the optimistic pieces in there. So that's how I got started. And I was really thinking about urban agriculture initially. I ended up moving to Washington, D.C. and meeting a guy named Jack Smith, who had an organization called the Urban Agriculture Network. I don't know if you're familiar with Jack.
Yep, I knew Jack. He passed away in, 2009 or something like that?
I actually think it may have been more recently, but time could be getting away from me. Yeah. So those were in the days really before the internet. Yep. And I had this, I don't know where I got it, but I had this great big reference book of kind of organizations that were doing things connected to food security and urban agriculture, or not just urban agriculture, but kind of sustainable agriculture and that kind of thing. And Jack's organization and name was in there in D.C., and I cold called, and he said, I was looking for projects in Washington, D.C., urban agriculture to work on. And he told me, well, I don't really work on domestic urban agriculture. I work on international projects primarily. But he said, I'd be happy to talk with you, and we could get together. And it turned out we lived maybe a mile or two apart, not very far away from each other. And so I had no idea who he was and didn't realize how much he had done in his lifetime. And at that point, I think he was probably in his 60s or maybe even his early 70s, and had really done some impressive projects all over the world. But he got together with me for breakfast at this little place in our neighborhood. We spent an hour or two talking, and he kind of laid out a bunch of things. And one of the things he told me was, you should go learn, if you want to have a big impact in urban agriculture, you should go learn farming from farmers. You should get out of the city and do that. And it's funny because he was kind of the second person that had said a similar thing. So when I took those workshops with John Jevons, myself and another friend kind of asked him about the urban agriculture thing because we were excited about urban agriculture. And he basically said, you need to get out in the rural areas, and that's a much better place to learn this stuff. So I took that advice, and it didn't happen immediately, but about a year and a half, 2 years later, I started apprenticing on a farm in California, and it wasn't a completely rural farm. It was still kind of on the urban fringe, and then spent the next 10 plus years working on farms basically on the urban fringe, so not super rural farms, but learning vegetable growing from people who are farming. So that's a lot of the evolution.
Wow.
Or at least the early evolution.
Yeah, and to have interfaced with Jack is amazing. I talked to him multiple times on the phone in the late 90s and early aughts. But I never was able to meet him face to face, and he is one of the epic pioneers of what we're doing.
Yeah, and I it's funny because I really just had that one interaction with him, and then I would hear his name occasionally, but I don't think he was very well known in this country at all, which is very interesting to me. Maybe in a small select circle, but I think it would be good if more folks knew about the work that he had already done, because I think a lot of people are trying to recreate some of the stuff that he has already worked on.
Yeah, well, and there's a book. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the book that he wrote, but I have a copy of it on my shelf.
Yeah, in fact, I haven't seen his book, but he sent me some manuscripts, and so I still have those in my collection.
Yeah,
so,
they're available on his website, which last time I checked was still up and running. So,
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. So you wrote a book, author of Compact Farms. What is a compact farm?
Well, I loosely defined it for the purposes of the book as a farm that is producing on less than 5 acres. But in my mind, it really is more just the way that somebody is approaching their farming. So, I could imagine some folks doing, 10, 15, 100 acres and still thinking of their farm as a compact farm. But once you get down kind of under 5 acres, it's hard not to consider yourself a compact farm and kind of do the things that I was thinking of when I was thinking of compact farms. So the loose definition that I was using was under 5 acres, but it's not limited to just people who are under 5 acres.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like rather than it being a farm thing, it's a system thing. Is that might be close?
Yeah, kind of a system or a state of mind. It's like, do you consider yourself a small farm or do you consider yourself a big farm? It's more how you think about what you're doing and yes, the systems that you're using around the farm.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've seen the book Lean Farm, but there's a guy, Ben Hartman, who wrote a book recently, and he's taking ideas from Toyota, essentially the manufacturing ideas that kind of came out of Toyota principles that came out of their manufacturing plants. And, a lot of, just to talk about this scale thing, a lot of those principles are the very same principles that you're using all up and down the scale. And it's very much about, the compact farm, I think, is very much in one sense about being lean and using a lot of those same principles, which aren't unique to Toyota, but they did a nice job of creating a structure and a framework that other people could follow in order to make those principles work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what kind of strategies are you using on a compact farm? Tell us about, conceptually now, explain, how do I create a compact farm?
Well, the first thing you do is you go out and you learn farming from other folks, but then once you've got a little bit of a handle on how these things work and some direct experience, I would say that the things that distinguish the compact farm, I mean, one is that you're forced into a lot of these lean principles, being very efficient in a lot of ways because you don't have space is limited. That's kind of the obvious feature of a compact farm is that you're doing it in limited space. So you're saying, okay, well, I'm going to limit myself in space, and that's something that I'm going to just accept, is that I'm not going to get bigger than a certain size. So I have to maximize how much that space is doing. And in order to maximize how much that space is doing, you really have to concentrate on getting top dollar per space. Yeah. And so there are certain crops that just are never going to get you that top dollar. So you kind of eliminate those from the running in terms of the crops that you're going to concentrate on. And the way that you market those crops tends to be a little bit different also. So it's trying to capture, when I'm talking about the farming, I'm talking about production systems that are commercial operations that are trying to make money. I'm not talking so much about kind of the backyard homestead, trying to feed yourself and your family. But a lot of these principles would apply just the same. So, how you market it is going to have an impact. And basically, the way that I think about it is, if you're on a really big farm and you're thinking of a really extensive farm and kind of these big conventional farms, they concentrate on getting their production costs low. They don't worry about how much space that takes because particularly in very rural areas, space is not a limiting factor, and it's not expensive to go larger relative to the production cost. In an urban environment, it's very much the opposite. So you're forced more into a compact farm frame of mind. But they don't try to capture any of the dollars past the production. So they do the production and then they sell that all in one big lump. So they have basically no marketing costs. As a compact farm, one of the common features is that basically everybody adds value onto that raw product that they're taking out of the ground by developing all the marketing behind that. And so they're getting paid for producing the product, but they're also getting paid for marketing the product. And in some sense, you make more money marketing the product than you do producing the product.
I tell people that want to start growing food and farming, my first question is, well, why do you want to do it? And they say, because I want to grow things. And then my next follow-up statement to them is, well, you realize that only 50% of the process is the growing it.
Yeah.
The other 50% is picking it, packaging it, marketing it, delivering it, and you have to figure out all of that. So if you're going to make a business happen around that, you have to know that.
Yeah, and I would say your 50% is probably a low estimate. I think if you on the growing it part, I would guess that's closer to 20 or 25%.
Oh wow!
If that. So the harvest and packing end of it probably ends up being the largest portion in some ways. But depending on how you do the marketing can end up being quite a significant chunk of that also. Yeah. And for compact farms, the essentially what I would call the overhead expense, which is the planning that goes into things and all the time that you kind of do spend setting up all your systems and everything else, that can be quite a large chunk as well, I think. So you do have significant overhead that you have to deal with. But the actual time that you're spending in the field, planting the seed, cultivating that seed, irrigating, getting it to a point where it can be harvested, that's actually relatively little time. Yeah.
So I went back to school late in life. I actually ended up getting my degree, my bachelor's and master's degree in 2004 and 2006. And before that, I was in technology. And so when I landed at Arizona State University in 1999, I was pretty much done with the technology. And I was looking for something to do while I was in school. And what I did was I grew food in my front and backyard, and I sold it at two different places. I sold it at a farmer's market, and I sold it to local chefs. And you kind of touched on this whole notion of specialty products. So I want to talk about specialty products, but also one of the things that I had great success with was I've made friends with 2 or 3 of the chefs around town, and I said, "What do you want me to grow for you?"
Yeah.
So that kind of wrapped up my marketing into a few great conversations, and then delivering great products to them, and then they just wanted more from me. So what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think one of the things I did with this book was I looked at, I profile about 15 different farms. I think it's 15 in the book. I've lost track, but I profile 15 different farms. And what I tried to do with that is I tried to really look at a range of different ways that people are doing it. So there are rural farms in the book, people who are doing it well outside of any town. And then there are farms that are urban. There's Brooklyn Grange is in the book, which is rooftop farm, well-known rooftop farm in Brooklyn. So that's about as urban as you can possibly get. So there's kind of the full range of locations. And then all of these farms are, have slightly different markets and marketing approaches that they've figured out over time. There's a range of ages of the farm. So there's farms that are 40 plus years old, been doing it for a long time. And then there's a few farms in there that I put in that are folks that have just started up in the last few years. So that are maybe 3, 4, 5 years into their production at the time that I was talking to them. It took 2 years to put the book together. So they're a little bit further past that at this point. And I think, a lot, as happens in farming, a lot of times no one season matches the next season. So you have to understand that this book is a snapshot in time. It's not what people are necessarily doing right now. But that, to get back to your question about the marketing approach, all these 15 farms, there are commonalities, but they also have shown a range. So some folks are doing farmers markets. Some people actually are doing a wholesale component, or maybe just direct to retail, or what I would call direct to restaurant, which I think is what you're talking about. Yeah. Community supported agriculture, CSA, is another approach that some folks take, and farmers markets. So they're mixing, most of them have, 2 or 3 of these elements. Some of them might just be doing one, but most of them have 2 or 3 of those different elements, and so they're marketing things differently. Yeah. But they really are, picking and choosing a crop selection of crops that they think they can sell, but also that they can, make money selling. And what I see mostly is that those are special crops that you're not going to get in just any grocery store. Yes. So it's things that are, have particularly special flavors, or a lot of times it's things that have really great stories that go with them. And a lot of people look at, the story as part of what sells it. I was listening to, I can't remember who was making this point, but I thought it was a really fantastic point, that even if these heirloom vegetables don't have the absolute best flavor, and normally people pick them because they think, oh, heirloom is the best flavor. Right. One of the aspects of them that's really fascinating is you are getting to taste history. It's like a physical interaction that you're having with the history, culinary history. It's one of the few ways that you can go back and experience the same thing. I mean, I think traveling to a location, and seeing historical sites is one way, but also another way that you can experience history is by eating these heirloom vegetables and finding out, what were people saving for themselves, and which of these seeds. So even some of the flavors may not be what everybody would consider the best, but they all have an interesting story, and there's an interesting reason behind them, as opposed to these big commercial varieties, which are basically bred for can they make it 1,000 miles, 2,000 miles? Can you harvest all of them exactly at the same time? Do they all look perfect and look exactly the same? And are they going to be harvested at the same stage? So in that compact farm, you can concentrate on these other ones and bring out those stories and be more successful in the marketing that way. Yeah. So it's a different product.
Yeah. I like to really explore, I mentioned it earlier, the specialty crops. And get really creative in what you're growing, because local chefs absolutely love that. Have you found that?
Yeah, I've worked with chefs for a long time, about 16 years now. I've been working with local chefs, and Portland, I'm lucky to be in a town which has just got an amazing food culture. Yeah. And when I got here, 2001 was when I started growing in Portland. And when I got here then, I feel like at that point I knew most of they didn't know me, but I knew who most of the, really, really great chefs were in town. And there were a handful of them. It was maybe there were six that were really pushing the local farm, direct farm to table in the restaurant scene. And then maybe there were another 6 that would buy some product sometimes. Mm-hmm. And that has just exploded now. I mean, I can't keep, for almost, 8-10 years, I haven't been able to keep track of how many there are, because there's just so many. Yeah. So we're surrounded by that up here in Portland. And when I travel to other places, I think that's exploding in other places as well. Yeah. And that's been a really great market. I mean, I think that those chefs are doing us a fantastic favor, because they are willing to recognize these aspects that they're not able to get from the big producers that are selling stuff for cheap, in flavor, in quality, stuff that's been harvested the same day, or even 2 or 3 days before what they get. Their call rates are lower, so they're able to see the value of those products, I think, more than almost anybody, and they give fantastic feedback also. So when I'm working with those chefs, I'm getting ideas from them on how to use products and also new products to grow. And I'm also giving them ideas. They're always looking for ideas from me. So, I always used to think it was just going to be me going to them and saying, oh, what do you want? What do you want? Mm-hmm. And what's the new special thing? But actually, what I've realized over the years, it's really more the opposite direction. They're coming to the farmers saying, what do you have? What's really great? And as a farmer, I have an opportunity to go out there and look for a lot of new and interesting, exciting products. It can be a tough sell sometimes, but we do have a lot of really wonderful chefs in this town that are willing to experiment with things. Right. So.
Well, and the truth of the matter is we get, 24 seeds and we grow some out and we harvest a really great looking product and carry it to the chef and say, all right, you want to play? And, if it's good tasting and looks good and is fresh, they most often go for it, I've found.
It depends on the restaurant
Yeah.
here, but and the chef's approach, but once you've developed those relationships, I think that's actually one of the most important things
Yeah.
about the whole process is,
Right.
Developing a good relationship with a chef. And if you have that relationship, and we're in a particularly competitive environment also, so there's a lot of growers up here that are doing the same thing,
right.
and so they have a lot of availability. So the relationship in some ways is extra important in that sense.
Yeah.
But once you have that relationship, absolutely, you bring them something and you tell them it's special, and they know
Yeah.
this is something special, and they'll go ahead and buy that. But yeah. So that's been really great. And then a lot of that information gets translated over into the farmers market or the CSA as
Yep.
well, because those chefs are showing people dishes on the menu that have these vegetables that they maybe
Right.
weren't familiar with before, and now those people start coming and look for them in the market. And so then I can start selling some things. 10, 15 years ago, it was very difficult to sell chicories. That's one of the things that I really love growing is radicchios and escarole and endive and that kind of thing. And in the last few years, the chefs have really picked up on that. And now, a lot of people have that taste for bitter that wasn't there 10, 20 years ago in the U.S.
Which is really cool.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
So a lot of what you're talking about today is really bordering on how do you make a living doing urban farming.
Yeah, and that's part of the underlying question that I was trying to answer in this book is, saying, with compact farms, which may or may not be urban, but, certainly urban is compact, what are some of the successful examples out there and how are people being successful? And I think it's really, really easy for people to kind of make this blanket statement of, it doesn't really make sense because it's too expensive and urban land's too expensive, but at the same time, people are doing it. Mm-hmm. So, maybe in some sense it doesn't make sense, but I think there's a lot of benefits that folks aren't seeing when they make that statement. Yeah. And I don't think they're acknowledging how much it actually is happening and has been happening for forever, basically. Yeah.
Well, and for me, while I was at school for about 4 years, from 1999 to like 2003, 2004, I was growing food in my front and backyard. I have a third of an acre. Back then I probably had 5,000 square foot of land in cultivation, and I was working very part-time, $300 to $400 a week.
Yeah.
Just playing in my garden.
Yeah.
Well, playing on my farm and, harvesting it and taking it to markets. And, for a stay-at-home mom or a stay-at-home dad or somebody that's retired or even somebody that's 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, that's a nice second income or, a small income for a young person, and on a third of an acre.
Yeah.
So it was amazing to me how much food I could actually grow here when I was concentrating on it.
Yeah, I think production is not the problem as much as the selling it. It's like the selling it I think this is what we were saying at the beginning is the selling it's what takes time.
Exactly.
You can grow it, no problem, but the selling it, that kind of kicks you up to the next level. Well, my own farm was very similar size, so I don't have the same farm anymore. I'm working with a friend of mine now, but. For 4 years, and this is profiled in the book, but for 4 years I had a farm which was Slowhand Farm. And I now use that name kind of as my general business name. I also do consulting and teaching and those kinds of things. But Slowhand Farm was a 2-day-a-week project. So it was just I just did it 2 days a week. Mm-hmm. And that was it was roughly 5,000 square feet. Yeah. So very similar size to what you're talking about. And I did a year-round CSA off of that with it varied from year to year, but it was about 25 to 30 shares that were coming off of that. Very, very small CSA shares. So my share was a unique type of share. But that was paying 2/5 of my income essentially.
Right. Exactly. Well, and interesting, as you're sharing, you and I are a lot alike. I have a farm.
The tech background.
Tech background, right? I have a farm. The farm happens to be my house. So the farm around the house is my hobby. And what I do is really to, make my way in the world is I educate people. I'm an educator and an eye-opener. And, and it sounds to me like that's pretty much what you're doing too.
Yeah, it's very similar. I continue to do production, and that's an important piece to me. And the 2/5 time is kind of the amount of time that I feel like works really well for me. And so I've continued to do that, and so I still do that. Yep. And that is really the grounding work for the rest of the work that I do, which, a lot of that is education outreach, kind of doing the writing and teaching workshops and that kind of thing. And then the other component, and I do some consulting as well. And then the other component that I've been working on, not as much as I would like, but kind of slowly developing more tools. So slowly developing more tools for farms in this scale range, because there really hasn't been that much available.
Right.
And I have an engineering background and a design background, and I really love bicycle technology, and I think that there's a lot of overlaps with the small farm stuff. So, So I've kind of thrown my hat in that ring as well.
Nice. Well, I'm going to shift on you, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you might have learned from it.
Yeah, I fail constantly.
That means you're learning constantly, right?
That is my point. I fail constantly. I'm trying new things all the time. And I really try not to look at things as failures. And so, when you ask that question, if you ask it straight, it's difficult for me in some ways to think of, what was a really big failure? Because I really try hard, and it's not difficult with practice to really just observe what's happening and try to learn from those things. So it's like everything is an experiment, and the result, whether something works out or doesn't work out, is somewhat irrelevant. It's learning what works and what doesn't work. Specific examples of failures. I think the thing that sticks with me the most, and I'm not going to get explicit about any one of these, but the places where I feel the biggest failures are in personal communications. And so that's something that I work on all the time. And particularly being somebody who wants to spread information and try and, be teaching and that kind of thing. When I have experiences, and they happen all the time, where I don't connect with somebody who I really wanted to connect with, or, those are the kinds of failures that to me are the most difficult to deal with, and that I kind of dwell on the most.
What do you consider your biggest success?
Well, similar to the failures, there's a flip side to all these, kind of look at them both ways. And so, with the successes, I would say, I think that I have a lot of successes, but those are all paired with failures. And so, it's hard to separate the two in my mind. I think, if I have to pick out something, and again, I'm going to be very general, but I would say, I think my biggest success has just been in making my life in a way, setting up my day-to-day and my life so that I'm doing the things that I want to do. And so that I'm able to, spend time on the projects that I want to spend time on, and to work with the people who I want to work with. And so I think that's been the biggest success for me. And there's been, in some ways it doesn't always feel this way, but there has been a lot of planning and intentionality that has gone into making that work. So it's not just the way that it's happened. There are a lot of things that have fallen into place for me over the years that have helped that to happen. But there has been planning and intentionality behind that as well.
I was talking recently with my sweetheart Heidi, and just about what you were just talking about. And it's like, I feel like if I get to the end of my life and I'm at the pearly gates and they ask me about my life, I will be able to tell them, even if it was today, I would be able to tell them I lived a well-lived life. And it feels to me like that's what you just said.
Yeah. I mean, I was, as an engineer, I was making a lot more money, and I did not work in that field for very long, but But basically the 1 year out of college that I worked as an engineer, I made more money than I've made since.
Oh yeah.
But I've been far happier working on these other projects, and it's really hard to put a number, kind of a financial number, a money number on all these things, and that's, I think, the hardest thing, is to explain to people the benefits of a lot of the urban farm, is because there is not a financial, in the way that people think of financial reward.
Yeah.
It's all these other rewards that are coming out of it.
Yeah. Cool. So what drives you?
I think just trying to be useful. I think that, and trying to understand how things work, and then to interact with other people to understand how things work, and also to let them understand how, what I've learned, and to learn from them. Yeah. And that's really it. So very simple.
Nice. So I'm all about education, and I have to know, is there a book that has been influential in this process in your life?
Well, there have been lots of books. So, coming from the urban background and not really knowing anything about farming growing up, the first place I went was the library, to try and find any books I could. And so John Jevons, who I've already mentioned, I would say, if I have to pick one book out, his book, How to Grow More Vegetables, was probably the kind of the most influential in those early years. And I still, his workshops and the information in that book, those still stick with me, and those are still very much in my mind when I'm thinking about my systems and developing my systems. And I think that book, I haven't read it for a number of years, but I've gone back every once in a while and looked at it. And it's very basic, but to me, very, very inspiring. So that's, that was a big one. Yeah,
that's a keystone book for a lot of people.
Well, it's funny, too, because I actually got Steve Moore to write a little profile. So Steve Moore is professor in North Carolina and on the board of Ecology Action. And he wrote a profile of John Jevons. He works with John Jevons for the book. And that was really important to me to have in the book, is to acknowledge the work that he's done. And in the course of writing the book, it was really amazing to me, especially with the farmers who had been around for, 25, 30, 40 years, to hear from them that that they had also been influenced by that same book. So that that continues.
That is the book that gets called out the most on the show.
Oh, it's a great book. And his planning sheets, that was the first place that I went where there was planning information that was really concise and that I could follow. And the few other books that I could find at the time, there was nothing like that in them. And so that was really the one book. There's so many more books that are really great out there now, and it's been fantastic to see all the books that are coming out and all the information that's available. But 20 years ago, it was much, much more difficult to find any information when I was just first starting out. Yeah,
that's How to Grow More Vegetables. It's got a long title by John Jevons.
Yeah, How to Grow More Vegetables Than You Ever Thought Possible on Less Land Than You Can Possibly Imagine. Oh, I think the possibly is not there, but then you can imagine. Yeah,
that's the one. That's the one. So what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
I think just to be a good observer, just in terms of growing advice. Maybe that's good advice in general. Yeah. But it's certainly for becoming a better grower, I would say observation is key. And really looking at what are things doing, and then trying them again and seeing what happens. And there's no substitute for time. I mean, I'm learning that more and more every year. So just the more experience you have over the years, I feel like I would spend 2 or 3 years getting better at growing a crop and making all those observations, and I would think, okay, now I've figured out how to grow it, and inevitably the next year would be a total failure. And it wasn't a total failure because I was doing something wrong. It was just that I hadn't had the experience of, whatever the condition was that happened that next year. Yeah, so there's that's one of the things that keeps me really interested about farming is and I think a lot of people feel this way, is that it's something new every day. Right. You're never going to learn all of it. And so, being a keen observer and keeping your eyes and your ears open and all of the senses all the time, I think is really important.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show and sharing your experience with us today, Josh. It has been a treat getting to chat with you.
Yeah, I'm so glad to do it. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
So how can our listeners get a hold of you?
So the best way is probably through my website, and that is Slowhand Farm, which is all one word, SLOWHANDFARM.com. And that links also to another website where I have a lot of information, joshvolk.com, and some of the articles that I've written over the years and photos of equipment and farms that I've been to. And my email address is linked to on both those sites.
Perfect. Plus, your book, Compact Farms, published by Storey Press, will be available in February of 2017. We're looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm excited to have that out there for everybody to take a look at.
Yeah. So you can find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/slowhandfarms. And that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast. Greg Peterson here, and I want to thank you for listening to the Urban Farm Podcast. We wouldn't be able to keep doing these great shows without you. So as a token of my appreciation, I'd like to offer you access to a list of our top 10 episodes I personally find most inspiring. If you enjoy the Urban Farm Podcast but don't have time to listen to every one, then you will love this list. Although all our guests have great information to offer, if you are short on time, these 10 are must-listens. To get access to the top 10 most inspiring podcast episodes, text FARMER to 44222. That's FARMER to 44222. And enjoy listening.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.